Welcome to the Nightmare Emporium. Here we take a deep dive into some grisly tales that are bound to make you lose your head. Now, let's check in with our host, the macabre marvel herself, to see what she has in store for us this week.
I hate winter. If I've never made it clear before, I'll deeply express it now. I hate winter. I could give the normal ramblings of how winter brings in the cold, sickness, and seasonal depression, but none of that ever really got to me. It wasn't until this year's winter that I was finally pushed over the edge, or guardrail, I should say. For the past several years, my area never really had a winter season that hit us hard. Sure, we've received a good handful of snow every other year or so, but this year brought not just snow, but also a hefty amount of ice, coating homes, cars, and roads that had not been touched by snowplows or salt trucks. These conditions never really fazed me in the past, but that was before I got a job and a girlfriend that lives outside of town. Before the big storm hit, during which the events of this story take place, I had spent the entire day with my sweetheart Kira at her house. She lives just in the neighboring town, just south of mine. Caught up with spending time with one another, we didn't realize how quickly everything outside had become iced over. I could barely even stand in her driveway, with my dingy sedan and its mildly worn tires, and my lack of experience driving in these conditions. We took the precaution of contacting my dad to pick me up in our family's four-wheel drive Jeep Compass, leaving my car to be subjected to the elements in Kira's driveway for the next couple of days. Finally, the harsh weather seemed to blow over, and the main roads had been treated. The calm during the storm, you could call it. So my dad and I made the trip to Kira's with the intention that I would be coming back with my own car this time. Of course, I stayed at her house for a long while, getting caught up in cuddling and watching a mediocre horror movie. But as it grew closer to evening, our pleasant time spent together was interrupted by the blaring notification that popped up on both our phones. Weather alert, heavy snowstorm inbound. I thought nothing much of it and essentially just shrugged it off. Kira, on the other hand, showed a little more concern. She was afraid that we'd have a repeat case where I'd have to abandon my car, or that I would get caught driving out in something nasty. Worst case scenario, I would just end up having to spend the night as a result of being snowed in, which neither of us minded the idea of. However, I'd been so hell-bent on getting my car back, so we made the agreement that I would simply leave early before the alleged snowstorm would come through. Looking back, I really wish I had just stayed the night there. After about 15 minutes of warming up the inside of the car and scraping sheets of ice off its windows, Kira and I embraced one last time before I headed out. That was the last moment of pure comfort and bliss before things turned that night. If only I had known what was to come, I would have kept standing there, stuck to her like Gorilla Glue. What I wouldn't give to have been able to return to the safety of her arms and stay. Alas, we had our final goodbye kiss and she sent me on my way, wishing me a safe drive and to text her immediately when I got home. I made it out of her driveway all right. All that was left was the good half hour of road that stood between her house and mine. About 10 minutes into my trip, and so far so good. I never spotted any significant ice patches, or at least I didn't notice any. The roads also weren't all that busy. A single car would pass me by every now and then, and I got lucky to have no one in front of or behind me for the entire trip thus far. The only thing that rattled me in the slightest was how some of the lines on the road were distorted from being covered in sheets of snow or were scraped off with ice that had been plowed. Overall, it was nothing but smooth sailing as a snow flurry sprinkled down from the sky. A couple minutes later, I was reaching up to a point in my route that involved passing over a short-length bridge just before coming back onto the road, where it almost immediately transitions into a wide left curve with a guardrail scaling its right outermost side. I've made my way through this spot 1,000,000 times before without minding any attention to it, and there was no exception for me to let my guard down that night. I passed over where the road converged with the bridge. You know that feeling you get when you're driving and you're just sort of off in space and the route you're driving is just automatic to you? Not a thought's going through your head, yet you navigate your way to your destination precisely. Well, I was very much in that space. From the corner of my eye, I saw a shimmering patch of ice reflect on the dark asphalt stretched out across my lane, where the end of the bridge met with the start of the road, but I didn't acknowledge it. Without slowing down accordingly, the ice caused my back two tires to lose traction with the ground, making my car veer sharply right. The sudden shift brought me back to reality, and in a panic, I attempted to correct my mistake by slamming the brakes while turning the steering wheel all the way left, which was undoubtedly the stupidest thing I could have done. Making matters worse, the whole vehicle ended up spinning out in a full circle and would have continued spinning if not for the impact it made with its right side in the guardrail. The force of the collision was so hard that the car had completely flipped over the rail and tumbled down the hill directly behind it. At that moment, everything seemed to slow down, as if I were in an action movie. As I was consumed by the thought of whether or not I'd make it out of this alive. It took a lot of effort for me to raise my eyelids, even more so my head, which rested on the steering wheel. It felt like I was picking up a cinder block with only my neck. Initially, everything seemed like a blur, but eventually I was able to fixate on my surroundings. Through the windshield, I could see the snow was falling harder, but my headlights illuminated a line of trees before me. My nose could also pick up on the scent of smoke, and the sound of what seemed like gears grinding rang in my ears. Suddenly, I jerked up in my seat from the realization of my situation. Quickly, I opened my door and stumbled outside to assess the damage. My movements were mildly painful, as indicated by the minor bruises scattered across me. It would have felt worse if not for the adrenaline rushing through me at the time. I then examined the body of the car, and while the driver's side made it out okay, the entirety of the passenger side was dented so deeply that no one could get in or out from that side. The wheels below it were also mangled and bent, and their tires were gashed. I could tell that the underbody frame was more than likely bent out of shape as well. It was easy to assume the thing was totaled. I shouted in anger. In these types of inconvenient situations, my anger would always overpower my sense of rationality, and the best way of letting it out was through exclaiming profanities. But deep down, I still had hope. I rushed back around to the steering wheel and attempted to move the car, but it wouldn't budge. My attempt was only met with the violent sounds of whirling, followed by depressed popping, indicating my engine's demise. I accepted that it would be impossible for me to get out of this by myself. I yelled again, slamming my fists on the wheel. From there, my go-to was to contact my dad. Sure, he'd most likely be mad, but he was my best bet of getting out of this mess. I pulled out my phone and was slapped in the face by the harsh truth displayed in its top right corner. I had no service. Instead of one of my bursts of anger, I let out a more reserved but agitated sigh, followed by a sarcastic, "This is just my luck," in frustration. I was still able to come to the simple solution of getting to higher ground, where I could then receive a signal. I got out of the car and surveyed the hillside from which I had tumbled down. The thicket surrounded me prevented any other convenient means for me getting up to the main road, so the hill seemed like my best shot. However, I could not, for the life of me, stand my ground nor retain any grip of the hill. The icy snow that had coated it was slicker than any other surface I've ever experienced before. No matter how hard I tried, my efforts were defeated by the almost non-existent traction. If I'd been in better shape, then maybe it would have been less of a challenge. I did consider going out into the wooded area behind me in hopes that maybe I'd get something, but there was something deep inside of me that restrained me from going through with it. I'm not sure if it was fear or what, but it was certainly for the better that I didn't venture out. Eventually, I just threw in the towel and sat back down in the front seat. It made for a much more comfortable setting where I could collect my thoughts and come up with another solution. Although I still wasn't able to completely concentrate from the unbearingly cold I had gotten from being outside. My fingertips were red and numb, and I could feel my sinuses starting to congest. With a sliver of hope, I put the key in the ignition and turned it enough to where it would turn on the battery, and, against my misfortune, heat shot out from the air vents. I was finally able to relax as my body defrosted, returning me to a state where I could properly focus and rationale out a new solution. However, the soothing warmth that filled the car returned the weight that had previously pressed down upon my eyelids. Before I knew it, I managed to drift off into a state of unconsciousness. In the midst of my peaceful slumber, I was awoken by the jarring sound of glass exploding, as well as the pain that came from the tiny crystalline shards that shot towards me and pierced my skin. Directly to my right, a large tree branch had burst through the windshield. A few more inches to the left and it would have pierced me. Quickly, I got out of the car to uncover the origin of how I was almost impaled. I turned on the flashlight on my phone and aimed it at the tree line, suspecting that the branch had fallen from there. During my inspection, I noticed that the car wasn't directly beneath any trees, nor were there any distinct limbs on the trees that were visible where a branch might have broken off. Even though the snow might have been falling hard, the wind was nowhere near strong enough to break off a branch that size, nor project it hard enough to break through my glass. I was just left there standing in confusion, but transitioned to acceptance because it all seemed like it fit in with the luck I'd had that night. Out of the blue, my attention was drawn to the sound of snow crunching under heavy feet in the nearby shrubbery. Startled, I quickly pointed the light towards where the sound came from, exposing the glimmer of eyes from that of a wild animal, outlined by a tall, burly silhouette hidden behind a couple of bushes. "Hello?" I shouted at it, but in response, the shadowy figure turned away and bolted. "Wait, come back. I could really use some help." My plea weakened as I heard their boisterous stomping growing more distant. It was wishful for me to think that maybe it was somebody who would be coming back to help get my car out like a tow truck, but I had the dismal belief that it was more than likely the owner of the land who saw a mess he wanted no part of. I trudged back to the car in disappointment, but was shortly overtaken by alarm when I heard a thunderous roar come from deep within the forest. It was a deep and grisly cry that thundered from what seemed too man-like to be an animal, yet too inhuman to be a person. I jerked back around to face the woods, as if I was anticipating some kind of attack. My heart was pounding like it was going to be anyway. In a moment like that, any rational human would have ran for their life, but I just stood there, completely paralyzed, expecting something else to happen before I could react. Little did I know that my expectation would come true when a clamorous pounding rustling started, heading my way through the deep thicket. The ground beneath me shook more and more as the terrifying noise drew closer and closer. I believe then it was fear that shot a jolt of adrenaline through me, urging me to sprint back towards the car. I knew that I would be too exposed to the threat charging towards me in the driver's seat, so I swung the door behind it open and quickly crammed myself into the limited space that was left on the back floorboard. Right as I slammed the door behind me, I knew that whatever was coming had finally reached me, and the same roar it produced once again, but this time all the more ear-splitting. The confines of the back seat still weren't enough to put me completely at ease, but out of curiosity, I was able to build up enough courage to peek over the center armrest to see what abominable thing lay just outside. My initial guess was maybe it was an angry black bear. Some had been spotted in this region before, but what I saw was nothing like any normal forest animal. Whatever it was, a quick glance was all it took for its distinct features to implant themselves deep within my brain and prompt me to cower back down into hiding. It was a beast that stood on its hind legs like a human being, cowering over the car at a height of what I could easily assume was 7 feet tall. It had a large and burly figure like a silverback gorilla and was covered in a thick, dirty white fur. The only exposed skin was that of its hand, shaped like that of a man's but tougher and the size of baseball gloves, with disgustingly long claws protruding from the fingertips, and its face, which resembled a feral primate with cat-like eyes and fangs as sharp as daggers that hung over its drastic underbite. I immediately recognized the creature as the same dark figure that I had assumed was a person from first glance. Oh, how wrong I was. It just stood there, sniffing the air, as if it were trying to track down its prey. I was oblivious to what its real intentions were, but just the sight of that abominable beast was enough to make me trickle the slightest in my boxers. After a while, the creature straightened back from the original slouching and curious position, and conveyed a tone of disappointment that it failed at finding what it was looking for. I prayed to God that it would turn straight around and return to whatever den it had come out of, but, in a sudden fit of rage, the creature let out yet another roar to the sky, followed by furiously slamming its massive fists onto the hood of the car, causing the whole back half, with me in it, to jump up from the ground. Then it seemed to finally accept defeat and got on all fours before running back into the shadows of the woods from which it came. Relieved as I was still so overwhelmed to the point I couldn't help but cry. There, death had stood before me, and by weaseling my way into what little space I had in the back of the car, I was able to evade it. For the rest of the night, I stayed put, lying curled up on the floorboard. As the hours passed till dawn, not a moment went by where I could sleep from the million dreadful thoughts that flooded my brain. What was that thing? Is it going to come back? Are there more of them? When the sun finally came up, the snowing had ceased, and I felt confident enough to get out, despite how stiff and sore I was from being crammed in there for so long. After stretching myself out, I was able to walk along the baseline of the hill till I reached a point where I could reach the side of the road that was up at a higher elevation, granting a couple bars of cell reception. I immediately called Kira to come and get me. In her panic, she questioned me. "What happened? Are you hurt?" I told her I would explain everything on the way back to her house. About half an hour later, I saw her car coming around the bend and decelerating the closer she got until she pulled over to the side of the road where I was standing. She parked the car and got out, to which I responded by running to her in a full sprint and wrapping my arms around her in a tight embrace. I had never felt more comforted and safe in my entire life, thus allowing me to finally let down my guard. Tears were pouring down my face. "Sweetie, what's wrong? Where's your car?" I stepped back and wiped the stream of tears off my face. "Let's get in first, then I'll tell you everything." By the time we made it back to her driveway, I had given her every detail of the story, from right before the accident to this morning. Her reaction signified disbelief, but the utter fear and trauma I displayed convinced her to take me seriously. "Well, did you tell anyone else about this? Like the police?" I remembered the initial thought I had late last night about contacting the authorities. I thought about it at first, but I figured I would only come across as some crazed Bigfoot fanatic. Can you even imagine the insurance company's reaction to the accident report I would file? I mean, I can tell you're having trouble believing all this nonsense yourself. There was a short moment of silence, but then Kira reached over and gave me a reassuring hug. She whispered in my ear, "It's all going to be okay now." I wanted to believe her wholeheartedly, but I couldn't shake off the feeling as the years passed. It's not every day that I think about that creature wandering through the woods, looking for the next thing to hunt, but every winter I get flashbacks to that night. When I see snow fall outside my windows, I'm reminded of how heavy it snowed during that moment in which I gazed at that beast. After leeching off others for transportation, I was able to save enough to buy a new, slightly used car, which I now drive in the most careful manner, especially during harsh, cold weather. I've also made a habit of driving ever so carefully when I pass over that bridge before the curve, even if the roads couldn't possibly be drier. It's become almost instinctive for me to get shivers when I go through there. Another thing I started doing was keeping a pistol stowed away in my glove compartment, just in case.
Well, wasn't that just a scream? Until next time, our fiendish friends, remember to stay scared, and sometimes it's more than just a story.